friends, I am back with Undead Pets, Night of the Howling Hound. This was written by Sam Hay, illustrated by Simon Cooper, and published by Grosset and Dunlop. So, we read chapters 1 and 2, and we've met Joe and his friends. They're on a camping trip in the woods with their teacher, Miss Brooke, and their principal, Mr. Hill. And while they are camping, Joe discovers that there is a zombie dog. And this dog leads him into Mr. Hill's tent. Turns out that it's Mr. Hill's dead dog. And the dog has absolutely wreaked havoc in Mr. Hill's tent and really trashed it. And he got a hold of some cookies and had opened the cookies and was eating the cookies. Joe came in, was talking to the dog, had the bag of cookies in his hand when Mr. Hill came in and caught Joe. Now, of course, Mr. Hill can't see his zombie dog. And so Mr. Hill is quite angry, and he is going to punish Joe by having him wash all the breakfast dishes, because, of course, Mr. Hill thinks that Joe made the mess. This is not the first time, apparently, that Joe and Mr. Hill have had a run-in. All right, moving on, Chapter 3. As soon as Mr. Hill let him go, Joe marched off to a quiet corner of the camp. He checked to make sure no one was around, then turned on Dexter. "You're nothing but trouble." "It's not my fault," growled the dog. "You should help me." "I can't," Joe sighed. "Now buzz off. People will think I'm nuts if they see me talking to myself." He glanced over to the breakfast table where the class was lining up for breakfast. He saw Spiker smirking over at him. "And what's he looking at?" said Joe, scowling back. "Who, Snotshot?" said Dexter. "What?" "Snotshot." "What are you talking about?" "That's what Brian calls him. He's got names for all of you. Silly names he uses when he's not at school." Joe's brain boggled. Funny nicknames? I didn't know Mr. Hill had a sense of humor. Then he glanced over at Spiker again. "So why does he call him Snotshot?" But Dexter didn't need to explain, because right at that moment, Spiker stuck his finger up his nose and had a good poke around before taking out a booger and flicking it at the kid in front of him. Ew. "Come and have your breakfast," Miss Bruce yelled, spotting Joe hanging back from the group, "before it's all gone." "Before Hooverhead eats it," added Dexter. "Who's that?" "Hooverhead, him, over there. That's what Brian calls him." Joe glanced over to see Nick the Stick, the tallest kid in the class, piling his plate high with food. "Come on, Joe," called Miss Bruce again. "Look, I've got to go," Joe hissed Dexter. He went to join the others and didn't look back. "Hey, Joe, want a cookie?" called Leonie, one of the girls in his class. "No, he's already had some," Harry, Spiker's best friend, said with a snicker. There were a few more giggles as Joe got his breakfast and went to sit down next to Matt. "What's going on?" Joe whispered. "Spiker heard Mr. Hill telling you off for taking his cookies," Matt replied, "and he told everyone about it." Joe looked around for Spiker, but he was nowhere to be seen. Dexter had disappeared too. He just hoped this time it was for good. "Okay," called Lizzie, "gather around and I'll tell you what we've got planned for today." Joe cheered up. This was more like it. "In a few minutes, we'll be starting the aerial adventure. The first part involves tackling the giant climbing wall, followed by a treetops wire walk." "Yes," breathed Joe. "When you reach the end, there's an amazing zip line over the woods." The kids whispered to each other excitedly. "Wait a minute," said Lizzie. "There's more." "After lunch, you'll be going underground into our tunnel trail for a treasure hunt. And finally, my favorite part," she beamed as she spoke, "tonight, we'll be taking you on a moonlight safari through the woods to see what wildlife you can spot." "Like wolves?" Spiker shouted. "Ooh!" howled Harry. "Who knows?" said Lizzie. "But before you go looking, you've got to get yourselves up that wall. So come on, follow me." "I'll never get up there," wailed Leonie as soon as she saw the climbing wall. It was more than 40 feet tall, with several routes up the side, color-coded for difficulty. 2 more counselors, Finn and James, were waiting for them at the wall, and a third, Chrissy, was already at the top. "I'll climb first," said Lizzie after showing the kids how to put on their safety harnesses. Then you can follow one at a time. Lizzie was an amazing climber. Joe watched her stay close against the wall, her hands and feet easily finding the holes. She reached the top in minutes. So there's Lizzie climbing the wall. I definitely can't do that, wailed Leonie. It's too high. Joe was just about to tell her to put a sock in it when he spotted something even more annoying. Bounding through the trees toward him was Dexter. Who's next? Lizzie called down. Spiker shoved Joe forward. Go on, Superman, he said sarcastically. Joe was glad to go first so he could get away before Dexter started bothering him again. But the dog was too fast. He arrived just as Joe was stepping into the harness. Are you ready to help me now? Barked the dog, leaping around at Joe's feet and letting off an enormous fart. Joe ignored Dexter, but it was impossible to ignore the stink that surrounded him. Ooh, groaned Spiker, holding his nose. What's that smell? Then he snickered meanly. Did you poop your pants, Joe? Is this climb too scary for you? Shut up, Spiker, said Joe, but some of the other kids were already giggling. Settle down, said Mr. Hill sternly. Come on, Joe, get going. Joe found the handholds easily. In just a few minutes, he was halfway up. Another 5 minutes, and he was pulling himself over the top. Lizzie beamed at him. You're natural. But before Joe could say anything, he heard a howl from the bottom of the wall. He could see Dexter scrambling around as though he wanted to climb up after Joe, before finally giving up and bounding away. Ben and Matt were next up the wall, followed by Abby, then Leonie, who was making such a fuss that James had to climb next to her. Spiker followed soon after, and once a few more joined them, Lizzie and Finn led them onto the Treetops Challenge. The wire walk is 100 feet long and zigzags through the tree tops. Tree tops, said Finn. There are ropes to hold on to and a rope to walk along. Ready? Joe nodded, but Ben didn't look excited. It's perfectly safe, said Finn. The harness will stop you from falling. I'll go first. Don't look down, Ben said, as he and Matt and Joe began inching their way along. Joe didn't mind heights. He followed the wire, weaving in and out of the tall pines. But then he spotted Dexter again, racing backward and forward down on the ground and barking up at him. Help me, Joe! Help me! Joe tried to ignore him. Ready for the zip line? Finn called as Joe reached the final platform. You go first, and Chrissy will be waiting for you at the end, okay? Joe nodded, giving his harness a final tug to make sure it was secure. Go, Joe! Matt yelled as Joe took off, whizzing down the wire. This sounds like an amazing camp. I think I'd like to go here. Wow, Joe breathed. The trees whistled past and the ground was a blur. He felt like a character in an action movie until his harness jerked him to a stop at the bottom and he wiggled around in midair like a fish on a hook. Chrissy caught him and helped him down. Joe's legs felt a little like jello, but he was buzzing from the ride. Then he felt his excitement fall apart like a soggy tissue. Dexter was there waiting for him. The dog launched himself at Joe, crashing into him and smothering his face in drool. Hey, cut it out, Joe grimaced. Dexter's breath smelled like sweaty armpit. But you don't understand, growled the dog. I can't pass over until you help me. I'm sick of waiting. Joe sighed. It had always been his dream to have a dog, and he would have loved one like Dexter if he had been alive. Okay, Joe said. Tell me what you need me to do. Really? You'll help me now? I'll try, but hurry. Joe glanced up at the top of the zip line. As soon as the others get down, I won't be able to talk to you. He could see Leonie waving her harness attached. Dexter glanced up too. Oh dear, Moni Leonie is coming. Joe grinned. Moni Leonie must be another one of Mr. Hill's nicknames. It suited her. Come on then, tell me what happened. But now that he had Joe's attention, Dexter didn't seem to know what to do with himself. He scratched his ears and chewed his tail, then jumped up and down and started pacing around. Finally, it came tumbling out. Brian loved taking me on long walks, but the trouble was I wasn't good at doing what he told me. Sometimes I'd get lost. Brian tried to train me, but it was so boring. I just liked to do my own thing. Then one day I chased a squirrel, and I ran right off a cliff. is the pictures of Dexter telling Joe his story. You see, Brian blames himself for the accident, Dexter explained. Why? Because he couldn't train me. He tried his best, but I'm not that sort of dog. I like to be free, run wild. Dexter suddenly turned his head and began staring at something in the trees. His ears pricked up, his tail began to wag, and then, "Rabbit!" he yelped. He was about to run after it when Joe made a dive for him. "Hang on," said Joe. "You haven't told me what you want me to do yet." "What?" Dexter was straining to get free, his boggle eyes darting left and right, searching for the rabbit he'd spied. "What do you need me for?" said Joe. "To make Brian see that it wasn't his fault I died." "What? Mr. Hill isn't going to listen to me." But Dexter wasn't interested anymore. The smell of the rabbit was too much. He jerked free of Joe's arms and shot off into the trees like a bullet. All right, that is the end of chapter 3. Tomorrow we will pick up with chapter 4. I'm kind of thinking this story is a little funny. I can't wait to hear what Mr. Hill's nickname for Joe is. Anyway, Falcons, I hope you all have a wonderful day. Till the next time.